Thanks, Al. And thanks everyone for joining us today. It's good to be with you. Yeah, we're going to talk about stress, the good, the bad, and the ugly, trying to emphasize that there is some good in there as well. It's about building resilience, managing stress in a pandemic. We'll touch that. We'll also, though, talk a bit about how this relates to mental health and mental illness. And in fact, yeah, get this going. Start off really with mental illness and why is it such a big problem? I've been working most of my life, it's over 40 years in healthcare, most of that time in mental illness, and organizations such as pharmaceutical companies and other research organizations have spent billions on this particular problem. Despite that, the global cost is going to cost us $16 trillion by 2030. Just a couple of years ago, 1 billion people consulted a healthcare practitioner with a mental health problem. Huge cost to the UK in terms of 100 billion in terms of the economic costs, and the sick days are high. Many people turn up to work, but they're disengaged. We see presenteeism. Amongst the young, 50% of mental illness emerges by 14 years, 75% by the age of 25. Huge amount during the years when we're supposed to be nurtured, growing up and we don't really do anything about it. And then we've got this thing about suicides. There's roughly 16 suicides a day in the UK at the moment. That actually is a relatively low level compared to what it has been in the past, but it's still 16 too many. And if you like, from a personal point of view, this picture that's here, you may be wondering, why is that photo there? Very grainy photo. It's a photo of a tube driver. And about 10 years ago, I decided I was going to kill myself by throwing myself in front of a tube train. And what stopped me doing it was seeing the eyes of a tube driver. I couldn't do it. They put me off. So rather than throwing myself in front of a train, I left the tube station. It was Cockfosters, the end of the Piccadilly line. Went outside and I threw up in a field next to it and decided I needed to get some help. But why is it, this? Why do we have these problems? And I think there's three things that are going wrong. Why it's because we diagnose mental illness using subjective measures. We ask people how they feel. And the difficulty with that is quite often people will answer in a way they fib because they don't want to be seen as weak. And then when we do find out if someone's in a poor state, we treat the symptoms. We don't treat the cause. So without looking at the underlying cause, it makes it difficult for us to prevent a mental illness. And the third thing, we know that stress, we're talking about stress today, we know stress is involved, but the research around stress is full of inconsistencies, and I'll talk to that as well. So we know it's a big problem. Let's, though, talk a bit about stress. Some stress is necessary. When you're in a poor physical state, you go through a whole series of exercises you can do, and you can end up being in a good physical state. So we see stress is necessary. We also know, when we look at other areas of life, I was born in the 50s, grew up in the 60s when there was masses on there about going to space, man landing on the moon and that. And there was this thing that when you're in space, you're weightless. And I always thought, well, that must be great, not to have any weight around us, be able to fly about, float about. If spacemen spent too long in space, when they came back down, their muscles had wasted, their bone density had gone down. They were in a poor physical state, and they needed help. They needed, for a while to be pushed around in wheelchairs. So some forms of stress are good for us. Some are actually necessary for us to function properly. But we also know that stress can be bad for us. And when we're under stress, well, we sometimes see faults in our behavior. We get angry with people. We get easily upset. We may use inappropriate humor. Okay, we do all those things. We also know if we're put under lots of stress, we may not perform so well. We make mistakes, we make the wrong decisions, we can't concentrate, can't focus on things. Our productivity goes down at work. As our physical health can be put in danger if we're put under too much stress. And we also know that things like immunity, when we're under lots of stress, we're more liable to catch diseases and that type of thing. And this is even the case with COVID. And it's our belief that a lot of the problems where people are having a severe effect to COVID is because they were highly stressed beforehand. They were in a very stressed circumstance. And again, we'll talk a little bit to that. And of course, we also know that stress can be bad for our mental health. If you're under stress for a long period of time, it can turn your mental health. You go from being healthy to being mentally ill. So really the question is there a good way to know the difference between the good stress, to know the difference to the bad and the ugly stress? Well, measuring stress is difficult, particularly when it relates to mental health. We haven't got a tape measure for this. Again, we often go back to asking people, how do you feel? And again, as I said earlier on, the difficulty there, a lot of people will fib. They say they actually feel a lot better than they are. And we put that smile on our face and we pretend we're in a good state when really we're not. Because we think it's a weakness. We think other people might look on us badly if we say that. The other thing is that some people, when they're in a really bad state, don't realize how bad a state they're in. So they too tick the good box, thinking, well, this is what everyone's like. There's no realization in their own mind just how poor a state their health is. So measuring stress is difficult. So all right, what about from a scientific point of view? Let's take a really scientific point and let's look at cortisol. It's a fantastic hormone, and we call it the stress hormone. We know it's related to stress in some way. Cortisol has lots of activities in the body, and one of its activities is regulating these other molecules called cytokines. Cytokines are very inflammatory, and when they're in high levels, what they do, they will go around and they will destroy other cells. And in fact, when they're not regulated, this is where they cause a lot of disorders that we call autoimmune disorders, when actually we attack ourselves. So the body attacks its own cells, destroys them. Lots of physical disorders like rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, Crohn's, psoriasis, as well as mental health, mental illnesses such as depression, anxiety. In the very long term, even things like dementia. So cortisol, which is anti-inflammatory, it's like the bucket of water to that inflammatory fire. When cortisol is working properly, it pours a bucket of water over that fire to keep it under control. So the cytokines then are regulated. And indeed, what they do when they are regulated, they do good things. They recycle our dead and dying cells. So where we've got dead cells, it will help us to recycle the proteins in them. So rather than the proteins go out with the waste, we keep the proteins, which is good. So that helps us build other cells, other connections, other proteins in the body. So this relationship between cortisol and cytokines is important. However, this is when it gets to the research, and the research can be confounding. And this little diagram, this is me back in the 70s and 80s. This is me as this stressed scientist working with other colleagues at a pharmaceutical company there that was back in those days called Wellcome. It's gone on, it's now you've probably heard of the Wellcome Institute that funds research. Well, Wellcome was the company that set up that research institute. And what we did, we went out and we looked at cortisol. We measured people's levels of cortisol. Did they have high or low levels of cortisol? Were they in a good or bad stress state? And we constructed, like all good scientists, we constructed this grid, and we started, after asking people questions, we put them on the grid. And we found that some people that had low cortisol were in a bad state. However, some people that were in low cortisol were in a good state. Some people that had high cortisol were in a bad state. Some people that had high cortisol were in a good state. It was all over the place. So there was didn't seem to be any correlation. Certainly there was no causality. We couldn't see any cause of cortisol being related to good or bad stress. It was a bit of a mess. And indeed, lots of people also looked at this work, and really we sort of said from a mental health point of view, cortisol is too difficult. We put it on the too difficult to sort out pile. We'll come back to that later. And I will come back to it later, but it didn't really help us. Okay, so what's the next thing we can look at? Well, in the last 10 years, I've been working for a company called COGNITION. And we've looked at cognition, we've researched it. And we believe that this is also could be linked to our response to stress. So could cognition help us find the answer? So what is cognition? Well, cognition controls your behavior and emotions when you want to achieve a goal, a task, or a challenge. Your cognition is the reason that you're listening to and watching this webinar now. And it controls how much you're going to take in of this webinar. It controls how many of the decisions you make, what actions you do differently after listening to this webinar, having not seen it first time around. So cognition is very important. It controls much of our life. It also controls your behavior and emotions when responding to things like a stress, a trauma, or an injury. And that trauma, that could be an infection. It could be the COVID infection, how you respond to that. So again, it as well as controlling our normal behavior and emotions, it's also when we're under that stress and injury problems. So if you like, good cognition keeps us in that anti-inflammatory state. So it helps us to allow cortisol to regulate the cytokines. It makes sure that we've got plenty of buckets of cortisol ready in case those fires come about. We've got the water to put them out. Now it does this. We see these results to stress and other things, not just as an individual, but we see this in families, we see this in communities, when a whole family, a whole community is put under stress. So we see societal responses as well. So today we could see the response of the added stress of lockdown as a result of COVID. So as well as looking at individuals, we're now able to look at whole groups of people. So okay, let's look at cognition in a bit more detail. It's made up of 5 domains. And when these are healthy in a good state, one of these 5 domains, working memory, this is our ability to hold something in the short-term space of our mind, think of other things, come back to that first thought and do some problem solving. Enables us to make decisions. So when our working memory is in a good cognitive state, we're good at problem solving, we will make good decisions. Episodic memory is our recall of past events that are relevant to the current context. So it's our ability to recall past experiences and then use them in the current context, again, to get on and do things, to get up learning curves. So it's the use of our wisdom. Attention is our ability to focus. So beginning of the day, you've got 3 things to do, and despite all that's going on, you find the time and the energy to focus on them, to concentrate, you get them done, you work your way through them. Processing speed is our ability to put our thoughts into action with speed and accuracy. So it's almost a bit like we look as though we're multitasking, but we can switch from one task to another and do so with that speed and accuracy so it looks seamless. And I always describe this, it's like one of those entertainers who's on the stage spinning plates on the end of poles, and they start off with 1 or 2, 3 or 4, and then at the end of their act, they've got 30 or 40 plates spinning. And they're able to do this because they work their way around the stage with accuracy and precision and speed, and they keep all the plates spinning. It looks fantastic. And then executive function, this is our ability to plan, to be creative, to have self-control. So when all of these are in a good state, it's almost like you may be at work and you're told you've got a project to do in a month's time. And that project could be stressful, but because you've got a good cognitive state, you sit down, you plan it, you get organized, use your creativity to think of different ways that you could achieve that project. And you start off down route 1, knowing that, well, if you hit problems, you've got contingencies, you've got routes 2, 3, 4, whatever in the background that you can use instead. And the great thing with that helps you keep your self-control, so that if you do hit problems, you don't get angry, you don't get upset, you just say, well, we're going to switch to another route, we'll still get there, we're still going to maintain this. You maintain control, you maintain that emotional control, you maintain that mental control. This is good for you. So this is where you've got plenty of buckets of cortisol, keeping the fires dampened down, you're keeping in a good anti-inflammatory state. This is good stress for you. This is how you're using good stress to build on your good cognition. It's anti-inflammatory. This is good for your mental health, which is great. Now, 2 of the domains, episodic memory and executive function, they play a role in our productivity and our learning ability, if you like. So when we're using those experiences, the more good experiences that we have, and even if it's a bad experience, we learn not to repeat it. We learn what to take from the bad experience, what good we can take from it. That makes us more productive. That makes us learn. Academically, we've got higher potential. So that's really good. Our executive function then can use those experiences. We can apply creativity. How can we change those experiences in a small way in order to bring about even greater learning, even greater productivity? So again, we use these in that context. They're linked. And if the other areas of our cognition are also working well, this again, it's a very anti-inflammatory state. It's a great state to be in, to be productive, whether at work or at school, in all the things that we're doing in a home life, with our friends and family in our community. So great. All right, but what about when things are in a poor state? So that working memory, it's in a poor state. It's not working well. So we can't hold anything in a short-term memory to be able to then think about other things and come back and make a decision. We forget those, we forget, it falls out of our memory. So we end up making bad decisions, or we become paralyzed. We don't make any decisions at all, but it's a bad state. And rather than being able to recall past experiences, we can't. We keep trying to recall things, but perhaps all that comes up is just bad experiences and they're not good for us. They keep going around in our mind. We can't focus, we're easily distracted, so we just don't get anything done. Even when we plan to do something, something comes along, we think, I'd rather do that than do this. This is too difficult. So those 3 things on our to-do list, they're still there at the end of the day. And rather than getting rid of them at the end of the week, we've got 15 things on our to-do list. The stress just continues, builds up. With our processing speed, we're slow and indecisive. And going back to that entertainer who's keeping the plate spinning, and rather than being able to get 30 or 40 spinning, we even had difficulty getting 1 spinning now. We just don't have the accuracy, don't have the speed to do so. And our planning goes. We can't look forward. We're stuck in a rut. And despite how smelly and awful that rut might be, we stay there because we can't see any point in going anywhere else. And then we lose our control. We don't have contingencies to fall back on. We don't have any plans. Anything goes wrong, now we've had it. And this is how our cognition works when it's a poor state. The cortisol isn't controlled. It's no longer being controlled. We no longer got those buckets of water around. Therefore, the inflammatory cytokines, they're unregulated. So they will actually start to attack us because they're in high levels. They will cause, depending on our condition they're in, this is how they can break down our neuronal pathways, the pathways we're trying to build in our brain. So the connections we're trying to build between neurons get destroyed, the proteins we're building up. That makes our cognition even worse. So we end up in a spiral down. And this is a very inflamed situation. So the fires are burning. As I said, there's no buckets to put them out. This is ugly stress. So this is when we get to an ugly state, and it's just a downward spiral. And if it goes on for too long, it can cause mental illness, can cause us to be mentally ill. And just as we saw this in terms of looking productive, how does it come out in terms of when we look at these 2 main areas? Well, our episodic memory, as I said, rather than being able to recall good events or a bad event and take the good from it, we just think about bad things all the times and we ruminate. They go around in our mind, we can't get rid of them. And down the other end, rather than being able to plan forward and be creative, we catastrophize about the future. We're just highly anxious. So this is where depression and anxiety come from. Some people suffer more from one than the other. Some poor people suffer from both at the same time, which is even worse. They're connected. And of course, our other domains may be in a poor state as well. As I said, this is highly inflammatory, lots of flames. So not a good state to be in. So, okay, we've seen that cognition is important, but is it like everything else? Is it difficult to measure? And once we've measured it, is it difficult to improve? Well, we can measure it. We've now got technology where we can give you this technology on a phone, on an iPad, and you can take what we call psychometric behavioral tests. We measure your speed and accuracy in these tests, and that gives us an assessment, a measure of your cognition. And we can see that most people come out around the mean in the middle. There's a large number there. And then towards the 2 ends, the poor end and the good end, it fizzles out. We get fewer people. And what we know from this is that people with poor cognition, they are prone to poor mental health, poor performance. People with good cognition have got more likely to have good mental health, more likely to have good performance. However, what we must note as well is that cognition isn't fixed, and you can go backwards and forwards. So even if you're starting in a poor position, you can get better, but equally, don't take it for granted. If you're in a good position, you can fall back as well if you're not looking after yourself. Now, a good way to show this is with what we call a bell-shaped binomial distribution curve. And what we see here, as I say, people with poor cognition, they're susceptible to low levels of stress. So just a little bit of stress can be enough to really knock them out. And this is where we find, when we measure in a population, this is where we find 80% of society's costs. So we find 80% of healthcare costs, social care, things like the criminal justice system, things like low productivity, all fall down here, so in a poor state. Down the other end of the scale, with good cognition, actually people here, they quite like a bit of stress. They actually seek it. This makes them more productive, they enjoy life, and they go for it. So it means that what we can draw on here is what we call a stress threshold. If you're above the stress threshold, it means you're in a poor state. If you're below it, you're working really well. And if you're below it and you've got good cognition, you've got the highest bandwidth for things like productivity, for good mental health, your academic potential, for good behavior. Everything is going well for you. So that's fantastic, isn't it? However, what you've got to be careful, even if you've got good cognition, you can push yourself over the top. And if you push yourself over the top for too long, you face burnout. And if that occurs again for a 2 period of time, you can fall back down. And if you're not careful, you can fall completely off the edge. You fall into that rut, into that pit of despair where things are looking really bad for you. So we now know we've got a handle on this. We can measure people where they are, and we can see whether they've got good cognition, poor cognition, and whether they're maintaining that good cognition, they're not falling off the edge, falling into bad cognition. We also know about what makes it to get stronger then under these circumstances. So again, if you're starting off in a poor state, you've got poor cognition, you can do things. You can put yourself under good stress, and generally speaking, it's doing some form of activity which can take you into a good state. So you're in a much better state. And then once you're there, you can then build upon that. So you can work, do other things that build out your mental resilience. So you actually enhance your stress threshold. You build it up, you build your strength underneath it. And again, this is good for your overall mental resilience. It enhances your mental health, your productivity and behavior. It gives you more protection to mental illness. So all of that's great. Now, we can also look at this in terms of events such as COVID-19. So COVID-19 comes along, it has an impact upon most of the population. And this can cause a squeeze on the stress threshold. So what you see that threshold collapsing. So all of us are now in the situation, even regardless of where we started from, we're more prone to stress. We're more prone to acting maybe more badly, being more badly behaved. We're more prone to the stresses that can cause poor performance, more prone to the stresses that can cause us to become mentally ill. So this means we've got to be careful. Now we can recover from this event, but it will take time. So this is what we would call a bad stress event, something that we can recover from, but we've got to be on the lookout for it. But it's critical we do what we can as individuals and as a society to strengthen our cognition, to withstand the pressure from infections or events such as COVID, to be in a good state so that we're prepared for them. Now, through our research, I mentioned before, we didn't have much of an idea early on as to why there was no causation, no correlation here between stress and high cortisol and the stress. Well, now we know why. If we had a handle on these people's cognition, we'd have been able to plot it out a lot more in terms of some people had high levels of stress, but they're in a good cognitive state. Other people have relatively low levels, they're in a poor state. It relates to where they were on the spectrum and where the threshold sat. So all that research that I did in the past without knowing people's cognition, this was why we got into a mess. Well, we can unpick it now. So we're making progress, we're shining light on this, and it's helpful to us in terms of finding means to keep us in a good state, in good health. Now, mentioned before that cognition controls our behavior and emotions. but also behavior through habits and lifestyle has a positive feedback on our cognition. Therefore, healthy habits are a form of good stress. So we can look at these healthy habits. We can look at things like good nutrition, hydration, drinking plenty of water, getting good night's sleep. We can look at physical exercise, that's good for us. We can look at our social relationships. These can all be healthy habits if we do them in a good way. And as well as making us physically healthy, these will make us mentally healthy as well, which is great. We can see that in terms of they help us to build our cognition and for us to be able to keep cortisol in a good anti-inflammatory state. Now, bad habits are the ugly things. This is the ugly form of stress. Now, the reason we call bad habits the ugly form is because unlike events, a bad habit is self-inflicted and it's ongoing if we don't stop it. So rather than something like an event which will come and go and we can recover from, a bad habit is something that we're putting ourselves under all the time. So I won't go through the bad habits. You probably, if I told you if you were smoking to stop smoking, you say, well, I've heard that before. So let's see, how can we go about changing habits? Now, habits form, there's a natural rhythm to forming a habit. There's a cue, there's a prompt, you're prompted by something. And this might be as simple as, I feel fed up, I'm bored, I don't know what to do. You then get into routine. Now, in this case, I'll put my tutu on, I go dance with my friends, and I have fun and I enjoy it. And actually dancing is terrific. So you get a reward from that. Now, you might not win any cups, but you'll still be, by dancing, as I say, you'll have good social relationships, you'll be mixing with people who hopefully have the same mindset as you, that you all enjoy dancing, you have great fun doing it. You'll be getting exercise. There's physical exercise in dancing. There's also a lot of coordination, hand-eye coordination, other coordinated things, which is good for your cognition. So dancing is fantastic. So the rewards you get from that, the short, medium, particularly the long term, you keep it going, are great. So whenever you feel bored, go dancing. It's fantastic. Really brilliant habit. But not all habits are good. So going back to that natural rhythm again, you've got the same cue here. Again, you're fed up, you're bored. So a routine comes along, and this time you're not thinking about dancing. You're thinking about, I'll get into an argument with someone. I'll go shopping. I just go shopping every time I'm bored. I'll go and gamble every time. I just won't do anything. I'll smoke. I'll drink too much. I'll eat too much. I'll put my face in a screen. I'll watch television all the time. And your reward from those, you might think initially you're getting something of a reward from those, but actually in the long term, all of those things are bad for us. So that cue of being bored there has set you off in a routine in terms of doing bad things. The natural rhythm has got you in a bad state. That will take you down. That will be bad for you physically, bad for you mentally. So how can you break that bad habit and form a good one? Well, unfortunately, the big word here is that discipline is required. Now, even before those cues come along, think, what is it that sets off those cues so that you can be better prepared for them? Think, I want to change this, so can I make myself accountable? I know I've got certain bad habits, so I'm going to tell people that I'm actually looking to change that habit. And I could actually find someone who's in a similar state to me. I could buddy up with them. I could find a buddy. Even better, I can get in a team. I can get in a group of people that we all work together. We all know we've got a problem, but we're all going to work together. We're going to support each other through this, not drag ourselves down into it. And then when you think of the routine, whatever the cue is, can I think of a good alternative to that bad habit? And that's what I'm going to work on. I'm going to build that new routine. So whether it is, I'm bored and I'm fed up, and the first thing I think is I'll eat a jam donut. Actually, I won't. I'll get up and I'll go for a walk. I'll go for a walk with my buddy. And just going for a walk in the fresh air stops me from being bored. It takes my mind off the fact that I wanted that donut. And actually the walk is good for me. Talking to my buddy is good for me. You can see how it goes. So build those into what you're doing. And look for reward in them. The reward may not be a short-term instant gratification. If it is a short-term instant gratification, they're normally bad for us. They don't do us any good. They talk about this dopamine response, where we get a little surge of dopamine, and in 5 seconds, the benefit's gone from it. So look for something that's long-term, look for something that's sustainable, and celebrate your success. And think of the reward, think of what it means to those who love you. and think of what it means to those you love. Because you think of it in those terms, that will give you, again, further impetus to be able to work through it, work with it. So that's how you can, I know I've gone through this really quickly, but think about it, how you can turn those, think of the bad habits, think of the cue, the prompt, the routine, the rewards. It'll help you get through them, changing them around to making a good habit. And again, this then, it strengthens your cognition, it builds mental resilience through these, and it brings about good stress. So you have good nutrition, avoid sugars, good hydration, drink plenty of water, avoid too much tea, too much coffee, too much alcohol. Plan your sleep. Make sure you get good quality sleep. It's not, the hours are important, but it's more the quality of the sleep that you get. Physical exercise is good for us. Don't overdo it. Do enough to get yourself fit and healthy. Don't make this an obsession. And social relationships. Make sure that these are relationships with people that respect and love you as much as you respect and love them, that they lift you. And have a nice word with them. If you say, look, the things that they do that take you down, have that word with them. Say, look, help me, bring me up. I want to take you up to higher heights as well. So build out those healthy habits. Now, how is this relevant to the pandemic? Well, it's got me thinking about how we went into this pandemic and how we're living through it, coming out of it. And if we compare ourselves to other countries, I don't think we're going to come out of it that well. And I think part of it is that our relative stress index was probably not that great going into it as a country. We've gone through lots of stress as a country over the last few years, and it has an impact upon us. So we've got to think in terms of, okay, maybe we went into this pandemic in a poor state. We've got a responsibility as individuals, as family members, as members of our teams at work, as members in our community. How can we get ourselves into a better state to come out of this? And when the next problem comes along that hits us as a society, we're in a much better state to face it. So we're not at the bottom of the pile. We can be one of the top. We can do it. So let's have some conclusions here. And hopefully, if you've got any questions, we'll answer those as well. Some stress is good for us. It helps us build healthy habits that support our mental health. It keeps us in that anti-inflammatory state. It helps us keep cortisol in a good state with plenty of buckets of water to put out the heat, the fire. Some stress is bad, and it comes from events of which we have little control. We need to prepare for those events. They will generally pass, but we need to be in a good state going into those events so that we're stronger coming out of them. We can learn that from COVID. Some stress is ugly because it's based on bad habits that are generally self-inflicted. And these will continue to undermine our physical and our mental health, ultimately could cause us mental illness until we do something about them. We've got to be strong. We need help from friends, from our community. But most of all, it's yourself. You've got to make the decision. Cognition, it gives us an understanding of stress and the difference between the good and the bad stress. And we can measure and improve it. Tech's available to do that, so we can do all of those things.